arrests in Saudi Arabia, as well as what might be ahead. Thanks for joining me.
David, it's great to talk to you, buddy. And we are on the verge of such a spectacular breakthrough for freedom and for the health and safety of our planet that I am having trouble sleeping. I'm so excited about what's going on. It's just amazing.
Really? So you're not despondent. You don't feel disappointed. You don't think that Trump has been compromised at this point.
Well, okay. Compromise is a very flexible term. I would say that there are things that this administration has done that are objectionable, and I think that's inimical to their greater objective in defeating the cabal. But I also think that running a government involves navigating a very complex minefield of different wants and needs and political groups and factions that are all pushing in different ways. David, I grew up in a liberal family. I grew up in upstate New York. And it was so liberal that the idea that anybody would even think right-wing at all, it was comical. It was ridiculous. I think we were all very surprised when Ronald Reagan won the 1980 election, as an example.
Mm-hmm.
So in my take on this, we're looking at the alliance is essentially now the military. And so what we do have with Trump is primarily a government that's being run by the military. And some people are really concerned about that, but when we start to engage on these topics about what I wrote, we are dealing with a situation in the world that is so hazardous that the military is the only group that could actually work to help us. So I look at the fact that the alliance, when I say the alliance, it basically is the military. There are certainly aspects of the military that are under the control of what we're calling the cabal. Some people call it New World Order, Illuminati, etc. Cabal is a more emotionally neutral term. And this war means that the cabal has lost control of the military. They cannot get the military to do what they want.
So at the end of the day, sorry to interrupt you, but at the end of the day, they lose them because it's kind of like rock, paper, scissors, right? He who controls the military and things like commander-in-chief, things like that, and things like the public sentiment, that's who wins. Rock always wins against scissors, right? It smashes scissors. So the fact that the cabal still owns a corrupt media, I think, is less than them no longer having control of the military, or am I incorrect?
Absolutely. And that's also why the mass arrests in Saudi Arabia, which is now publicly documented, over 200 individuals arrested, is immensely, immensely significant. Because Saudi Arabia was the clandestine intelligence center and oil-based financial center for these false flag attacks and proxy military organizations that the cabal was still using, like ISIS, in order to engage in their depopulation agenda. So the fact that that has happened, the fact that, and now we just see today that MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, is now going to become king, and his father is essentially stepping down into a ceremonial role. The mainstream media is trying to frame what happened in Saudi as being this overpoweringly negative coup. And what we need to remember is that some of the people that have been arrested are directly tied to things like Clinton Foundation, to things like Twitter, Facebook, to things like MGM. They owned the part of the building where the shooting came out of in Las Vegas. I mean, there is all kinds of stuff.
Well, to mention that for a second, in one of your prior posts, you had gone into some of the occult and film connections to the Vegas shooting, and so if your opinion, or at least one of your possibilities, is that this was some kind of shelved attack on the American people that the cabal carried out as some kind of weird, ritual. Why do it now when they're down, they're going down in flames? Millions of us have found out. Why make it even more obvious?
Well, I've had the displeasure of knowing psychopaths and having to deal with psychopaths in my own life. And the biggest thing that the psychopath does, and I'm not going to use profane language, but it's F you can't tell me what to do. That is their personality. That is the way they always will act. Anytime their back is up against the wall, they will rip and claw and scratch and bite, and they cannot just be humble. They cannot surrender, and they will only get worse when they're in trouble. And so I think what we're seeing here is, if you look at the media that we've laid out there, we have a movie all the way back in 1999, Mars Attacks. I believe that was the year. It was late 90s. And Mars Attacks totally depicts an attack on a crowd of people at the end of the film, the big climax, in that exact area where you have this pyramid with the brightest, that capstone on that Luxor Hotel's pyramid is the brightest light in the world. They've got all these mirrors concentrating that beam so that you can literally see it from Los Angeles. And I do. I mean, sometimes at night, I actually see the beam from that effing pyramid out of my window. So, they set this thing up a long time ago. They planned this a long time ago. They built that whole area as a ritual slaughter site. And then they get the name of the guy, Stephen Paddock. Stephen means crown, and Paddock is where you keep your farm animals. So it's like the crown wanting us all to be their slaves, our farm animals.
Wow.
See, so this is, and then the name of the guy, right? They bring the guy out on Ellen, who, no offense to her sexual identity or anything, but she's a dancing lesbian comedian, right? And that's what they do, is they bring out this guy named Jesus Campos. And I've said this before, too. Jesus Camp is a movie that very, very unfairly stigmatizes far-right conservative Christians as being so odious that they're, the objective of something like that would be to see them and their lives as totally expendable, and that, in fact, it might even be a good thing if they died, because then there will be fewer of them. And so this is where you get terms like Trump tards and this kind of stuff that they're using to try to demonize anybody who actually did want Trump to be elected. Mm-hmm. And I'll tell you what, there's a lot of people who did. The people who hate Trump can't even imagine that anybody actually wanted this, but there's a lot of people who did, and I find them all the time. So it's a very interesting landscape we got here.
Yeah, definitely. So how far up is Trump able to go? Does he bring down the Podestas? Does he bring down the Rothschild clan? How much of a clean sweep will we see here in relation to what happened in Saudi Arabia?
Well, again, what I would recommend is to try to not make this about Trump. And here's why I say that. One of the people I interviewed for Gaia was G. Edward Griffin, the legendary author of The Creature from Jekyll Island, which is...
Oh, yeah, I met him at this Aspen Money Conference recently. A very interesting guy.
Yeah, so, Jekyll Island is the book that Ron Paul quoted from when he was knocking the Fed. It's still the best book anybody's written about that. And when I interviewed him, he talked about one of his earlier books that he wrote, because, most people don't ever ask him about anything else but Jekyll Island. And one of his earlier books was an expose of what happened in the 1950s, where one of the top U.S. generals was seeing that in the Korean War, every time they tried to position the troops in various locations, the enemy had already anticipated where they were going to be, and they got ambushed and they got wiped out. And it was very, very bad. Now, eventually what they did, and this comes from within the military, is and again, don't take my word for it, this is G. Edward Griffin, who's like the godfather of conspiracy theory. He wrote the whole book on this. What we find out is that they started to put disinformation in the briefings, and each one was salted a little differently. And through that, they discovered that because they had to do a mandatory by international law, they had to report their troop positions to the United Nations. And those reports were the ones that were leading to the ambush. Now, this is treason on a level that is so unimaginable to a military mindset, it's just absolutely staggering. But what that means, if I can translate for you, is that the United Nations was working against the U.S. military while portraying itself as being a benevolent organization that was intending to have world peace. It's exactly the opposite. In much the same way that, you have the Red Cross, and this is something I've never said publicly before, but I want you to think about this. What is the Red Cross? The Red Cross is the Templar Cross.
Mm-hmm.
What did the United Nations do? It stipulated that you cannot attack a Red Cross facility. So what will they do? They will have the wounded being treated in those facilities, but then they'll also organize spies and intelligence and assassins and all kinds of stuff in those same facilities so they can't be wiped out. So this is the type of weird treason that they do. And, of course, the Red Cross on a white background is totally their symbol. You see it all over the place. There's all different iterations of the cross, the Maltese cross, all different versions of it. So my point in telling you this about G. Edward Griffin is that the military from the 1950s came up with a systematic plan to address what was really going wrong and to find a solution. Another curious side note to this is the American aircraft tycoon Howard Hughes.
Mm-hmm.
And Howard Hughes was dealing with the aeronautics industry, to some degree the airspace industry, and in that context he became aware that there were Satanists in these organizations. And so, because Howard Hughes had limitless money, essentially,
right. He was like for people who don't know, he was like a real life Tony Stark. He was behind Hughes Electronics, which later became DirecTV. That was one of their spin-offs or something. So just very smart person, right? So
I would actually even wager that Tony Stark is based on Howard Hughes. It's pretty obvious, and Howard Hughes is a key figure in the Alliance. So yeah, and those Marvel superhero films, at least everything but X-Men, are very, very Alliance-oriented. So, yeah, that's an interesting side note. So, I've had very good intel, and this is now, I want to be clear, I'm not bragging, and I certainly didn't ask for this, but I have spoken to people who share things with me that they hardly tell anyone. Some of these people worked with U.S. presidents in various administrations, so they're at that level. Some of the people I talk to have security clearance above the level that the President of the United States has. And I'll give you an example. I just heard from one of my insiders, Pete Peterson, who's well known publicly if you follow my information. And he was actually called Dr. Do by Ronald Reagan because he was I like to call him the Tesla of Black Ops. He's a very, very genius scientist. I was on the phone with him last night, and he spent about 30 minutes telling me the various equipment that he bought with the money from the fundraiser that we just had for him because he had everything he owned stolen. His entire lab was destroyed. So now he's rebuying the lab, and he spent half an hour talking to me about multimeters and spectrum analyzers and all this stuff that just went way over my head. And I'm a pretty smart guy, but not like that. So anyway, Pete Peterson, Dr. Do, according to Reagan, told me not too long ago that Trump, they're telling him right now, this is the military-industrial complex, telling him that he would have to be president for 2.5 years before he gets cosmic clearance. And cosmic clearance is what you have to begin to get anything substantive about the UFO situation. So Trump does not have as much clearance as some of the people who I already am in contact with. And that seems crazy until you start to understand how this inner world really works. So, again, what I'm saying to you is that I have somebody who I've been speaking to who's got a greater clearance than Trump already, who detailed in some length about Howard Hughes and this idea that he became aware that there were Satanists. I mean, they call themselves Luciferians, but for most of us, there wouldn't be much of a distinction there. For them, there is. That's a whole other discussion. They think Lucifer's the good guy, and that the God of the Bible is an evil being they call the demiurge. They have this weird religion where they kind of flip everything backwards, and they act as if all the stuff that the major monotheistic Abrahamic religions tell us to do is actually restricting our freedom and limiting us from enlightenment. And I don't agree with that at all. But I do understand their religion. It's very complex. very weird, and they do get off on these mass ritual acts that are loaded with codes and ciphers and hidden meanings and all kinds of weird stuff. So just to get back to the point, Howard Hughes hired these women, female intelligence agents, to infiltrate the cabal, and they did it sexually. So they were working as prostitutes, basically. And they were having intimate encounters with top cabal people, and then asking them questions while they were very vulnerable and had just finished having sexual intercourse. And from this, they were able to deduce an incredible amount of information. These men just opened right up in that context. And the women portrayed themselves as being interested and wanting to join and all this kind of stuff. So a lot of the cachet of data that the Alliance came into contact with originally started from Howard Hughes. And you made me just realize that that's why Tony Stark is so important in these Marvel films, because the Marvel films are absolutely Alliance films. We know the military has been trying to recruit through films for a long time. It's kind of an open secret that 75% of a lot of these action films, especially military-oriented films, 75% of their production money comes from foundations and front organizations that are basically shell companies owned by the military industrial complex. If you talk to insiders like I do, that's well known. So that's one of the best ways to encourage a voluntary enlistment. We don't have any mandatory draft, and so there's a lot of films that encourage the heroism of being a soldier and fighting valiantly against the enemy, this kind of stuff. But really, the military has turned on the cabal. And that all started way back with this stuff that happened with Howard Hughes and the data that he acquired, and then this amazing treason that took place in Korea. And from that, a binder was created that was a systematic plan to defeat the cabal. And so I'm literally not kidding when I say that this plan was drawn up by the military in the 1950s. And they got so deliciously close to pulling it off in 1963. But what happened first? Well, obviously, the beloved American president was shot in broad daylight in Dallas.
Right.
And he had already implemented some of the final stages of the plan, which included that they were going to start printing U.S. dollars backed by silver and not Federal Reserve notes, which is a very important point. The Federal Reserve is a private corporation. I'm sure everybody, that they know this, and they're going to feel smart when I say this because they already know this. It was founded in the beginning of the 20th century, right around World War I. And what it's done is it's decreased the value of the dollar by well over 90%. It's private bankers of a foreign country that we outsourced our money to after they made a series of false flags to make it look like, those bozos in the U.S. government are not smart enough to be able to take care of their money. Let's leave it to the hands of these really wealthy guys because they know how to make money. And we'll outsource our currency to them. And then anybody who didn't like it was invited to take a ride on a ship called the Titanic, and then they deliberately sank it. And I know it sounds crazy. If you haven't heard this before, you're going to be like, oh, come on. Now, that was what Woodrow Wilson was talking about when he made the quote, because he knew about what the Titanic was. When he said, there exists a power somewhere so subtle, so watchful, so organized, that men dare not speak above a whisper when speaking in condemnation of it. That's what he was talking about. So I'm dropping some bombs on you here, and,
yeah, I want to get this...
Your hair standing up and your skin tingling, that means you're waking up.
I want to get this out there quickly because I think for a lot of my audience this will be new information, and of course there'll be a link right in the post below or right in the description below that goes to your whole blog post on this topic. But my kind of final question for you, just so we can keep this to a shareable length, my final question for you is, as this starts to sink in, it's so incredibly disturbing to even a rational thinker that there has been a multi-generational occult, banking, mafia, basically, kept secret at the deepest levels, that kills off people who start to hint too closely at what they're about. People like Stanley Kubrick, people like Andrew Breitbart, who had a heart attack. When you come to the reality of this, it's so disturbing, right? That former presidents have been cabal members. Pretty much everybody after Kennedy, up until Trump's election. Trump broke the chain of cabal shills, pretty much, in my opinion. How do you cope with this? Like, you're a spiritual guy. Like, what do we do? What's the solution? What should individuals do right now?
Well, the awakening has already started. It's still voluntary at this point. You still have the choice of whether you want to believe this or not. That choice will be removed. In other words, it will be known. It will be a fact. It will be a publicly documented certainty that a good part of our world was being run by a group that practices satanic type of activity. So that is going to be very difficult for people, and your audience, David, is already dealing with the emotional. I started to deal with it back in 2000, 2001, when I really got into it reading this whistleblower named Savali, S-V-A-L-I, and she was a mid-level Illuminati member, and that is what they call it, and she was involved in mind control. And she goes, there's a whole book she wrote on how they do it. It's very, very technical, but the scope of the things they do, in order to get mind control to work, you basically have to have unimaginable trauma that doesn't actually kill the body. And so they use things that are so psychologically overwhelming that even though you don't die, your mind cracks. And one of the things that works the best is ritual abuse. If you bring an unsuspecting person into a satanic ceremony, and now you got guys with robes and they're chanting and they rape you, and your mind most likely will fracture. So they have tried for a long time to keep us in fear. And one of the things that I can tell you, very, very encouraging, is it appears that this new insider on 4chan, we had Meganon, and I was talking about that one in the previous article. This is a guy that seems to be FBI, seems to have been speaking since June 2016, though he's only acknowledging speaking since May 2017. He did an interview a few months earlier with Victorus Libertas, and I'm going to be interviewing with them too.
Oh, great. That's great.
And yeah, it's the same dude. And I don't think it's a woman. Sorry, I just think this is a guy making counterintelligence. But anyway, he has now certified, at least predominantly, the authenticity of another insider who showed up called QAnon. And so I started to survey this QAnon stuff, and at first it was too good to be true. I was saying, no freaking way. But I will say this. My own trusted insider sources, and again, the way I got here is by not betraying them. I've been able to keep my mouth shut about certain things so that I can stay alive and that I can keep them happy. And you have to do that. You can't just blabber whatever they tell you. You have to be able to be trustworthy. So that's why I'm able to share some of the things I can share. We now have heard that QAnon is the real deal. And then I started to analyze things. You read my latest article at mindcosmos.com.
So you believe that even though Trump didn't say anything big in his speech yesterday, you still believe that QAnon is the real deal?
Absolutely. There's no question. Because the guy, and I'm going to do a more involved analysis of this coming up. But
by the way, isn't it funny that they've had all week to clean the floors outside of my place, and it's just now that you happen to call, and that we're recording this conversation, which many people are going to find valuable, that the cleaning lady has just, we've been watching actually and laughing, she's been moving back and forth right outside of my apartment. So it might render part of the recording less usable, or maybe it's a surveillance attempt, I don't know. But it does start to give you the creeps, right? Earlier this year, when I took a few days off from all this stuff, I went up to the mountains, very remote lodge, and within 2 hours of checking into this very remote lodge, I noticed the telephone company is right out in front of my unit, right out in front of my cabin lodge, and they're repairing the telephone lines. What are the odds that a repair request came in within 2 hours right in front of my remote lodge. They just have to know everything you're saying, right? So,
I have thousands of stories like that, David, and that is, I mean, you have to understand, okay? A guy like you, I'm just going to speak about you. I won't speak about myself, but it applies on both. A guy like you, they not only know when you farted, they can calculate the volume of gas. I mean, they are monitoring you so hard, dude. Every word you say. They're looking at the jiggling of the windows in your house with satellite lasers.
Really? You're trying to make me...
the audio of your conversation that way.
Well, it's...
Every word you say is being documented and transcribed. People have transcripts of it. I guarantee it.
Who are... Just remind people, who are these people doing this? Is it the deep military-industrial complex? Is it the bankers? Is it the bankers? Right? Like, what's going on here?
There's all kinds of different names for them. You know, deep state is kind of becoming a popular one recently. New World Order used to be popular, and it's both sides. So
no, you're right. Definitely, I think so. My fans will remember this. I tweeted out a couple of weird things about seeing law enforcement in front of my apartment, and I never brought it up again. And people are probably wondering why. It was brought to my attention they were there for my protection. So there is. They were made aware of some kind of communication that I was not privy to and decided to place me under protection. So, interesting stuff, right? There definitely is a layer of surveillance.
You know, the reason why I wanted to talk to you, David, is you've got balls. You got brass balls. And I admire that because, frankly, I think there's way too many people who are totally anonymous. And, dude, I'm just going to speak to you now, Mr. Anonymous, whoever you are. Do you really think they don't know who you are? Do you really think that just because you can shield your identity from other kids on the internet, that they can't figure it out? They can even track Tor browsers now. Doesn't matter how many times you ping around, make a fake IP address. They know who you are. So it's stupid for people to be anonymous. It's a lot smarter. It's a lot safer to have an identity with a real name and a real face than to wear a frickin' rabbit mask or to create some anonymous fake identity or whatever it is that people are doing, to wear the V for Vendetta mask, you know?
Right, the Guy Fawkes mask. Yeah.
All you got to do is be yourself and go out there and say the truth because, and again, David, I don't mean to denigrate your sacrifice or my sacrifice, but come on. Vietnam, my father had to serve and fight and risk his life. You know, Korea, World War I, World War II. Our fathers, our forefathers, our grandfathers, they all had to do this. They all had to step up and risk their lives. And now we have such a comfortable life. Everybody wants to watch this on their phone and then rail off in the comments if you or I don't do what they want. It's like, well, Mr. Anonymous Commenter, show me your website. Where are your videos? What gives you the credibility to step up and act like you have a right to tell us that we're not doing the most perfect job that you could imagine we're doing?
Right.
We need more people. We need the civilian army to fight this information battle because it is a battle over opinion. Is the opinion of the public going to be that this is a good thing once the military does what they need to do? And let's please bear in mind, this is not a coup because only be dealt with militarily, most likely. And so they've kind of come to, you know, the alliance has come to the inevitable conclusion, it appears, that the only real solution for this is going to involve some military activity.
So that's why QAnon came out when he or she did, right? Or when he did.
Yeah, and QAnon has some very obvious ciphers in it where they use like 41020, and that's DJT, Donald J. Trump. It may not be strictly Trump writing it, but it's definitely people that are right around him, and it's definitely people that are at times saying things he wants to say and leaking intel that only they would have. And so this is a truly amazing, amazing event. And a lot of people in the truth community are starting to pick up on it. But it's staggeringly complex. And we're learning all kinds of things from this insider. And I find it incredibly exciting because, look, this is going to happen. And in terms of the glory for the people who are willing to not be anonymous anymore and step forward and be involved in this, you're going to have a lot more significance after the fact, because right now it's dangerous. In the future, everybody's going to talk about it as if it's a thing, just like in a post 9/11 world. Everybody, we know the Twin Towers came down. Now it's going to be, we know that the Satanists were running the government, running the media, and they got taken care of. They all got dealt with. We understand that. That's very sad.
How is it? I mean, just from a logic point of view, how is it possible that it's persisted for so long? Why is it that no prior presidents have been able to go, okay, well, I had to use them to get to where I am, but now I have enough regional power. I'm just going to take these people out. And why didn't leaders in other countries say the same thing? Why did a secret clan of bankers who raped children, how did they maintain several centuries of dominance? It doesn't add up to me. And I'm not saying I don't believe it, because I do. It's overwhelmingly obvious if you read the Podesta emails and Hillary's emails that these people slavishly answer to the Rockefeller family and the Rothschild family and the Soros family.
Well, I want to bring it back to a theological question in answering you, and say, I'm going to start with questions, and then I'll answer them. Why would a loving God create rules, spiritual rules, in which these people are allowed to get away with it if they tell us what they're doing in symbolic form? And that is what happens, right? The secret to black magic is that you got to tell people the black magic, and a much more primitive and simple form of that is voodoo. If somebody is doing voodoo, what are they going to do? They make a mojo, which is like the little doll, and that's why the term I got my mojo working is actually in blues songs a very dark term, because it's talking about a voodoo doll that's being made for this guy who wants to sexually conquer a particular female. So they make a mojo, and then they stick pins in it, and then they have to leave it in front of your house, or they'll behead a chicken, leave it in front of your house, that kind of thing. They do that because your fear fills in the cracks. Your fear creates the reality that they want to achieve. So fear is a ballet dance. If you're just standing there and all of a sudden somebody stabs you from behind, you never heard them coming, you're going to die so fast if it goes right through your heart, you won't even notice, you won't feel any pain, you're just dead. So if the lights go out in the room and then you hear shuffling noises and you hear somebody coming and you hear them breathing, now you're going to be afraid. Now you have reason to think something bad is going to happen. So what these people have done so brilliantly, and you have to give them credit, they are very intelligent. What they've done so brilliantly is to create themselves as supernatural villains. They want us to think that they are somehow possessing of superpowers. And so I can tell you, as a kid who watched horror movies with his father, I think it was great training for me to be able to handle this, because I watched horror movies well below the age where you're supposed to watch them. I started to watch them probably 12 years old, something like that. Mm-hmm. And you learn when you're watching a horror movie, okay, everybody's going to die, so don't fall in love with any of the characters, and be ready for anything to happen at any moment. And so when you learn those two rules, you're pretty much able to watch it, but you have to kind of go into a different mind state. You can't bond with anybody in the movie. So what I see is that this is like a horror movie. It's like the world is like a horror movie, and a lot of people are not really trained in how to handle horror movies. But when you have this loving God that authorizes negativity to occur, providing that it's being advertised, providing that it's being shown to us, then that suggests that at some point in the future, this whole system will fall apart for the negative. In other words, look, the first guy to really figure this all out was John Dee, the court astrologer for Queen Elizabeth. And they hold him up in very high regard because he's the guy that re-derived the secret of how to get these nasty spiritual beings to do what you want. And so they were actually doing occult stuff in the Elizabethan era. And it worked. I mean, for example, I've had at least 3 different high-level insiders tell me that 2 different times Spain tried to invade England. And John Dee, they did the requisite ritual stuff they had to do, and then whatever entities they apparently were in contact with told them, don't worry about it. Don't send out your armies. Don't do anything. Let the Spanish Armada come sailing in. And they did. And then there were these massive storms, and the sea gets all crazy, and the whole entire armada sank, and everybody died. And it happened twice. Now, that looks like magic. That looks supernatural. But if you can consider the possibility that one of the big secrets here is that there are extraterrestrials, and those extraterrestrials have anti-gravity, right? So then all they have to do is churn up the ocean. Boom. Sink the armada, just like that. Simple, simple, simple. So it does appear that part of the big secret here is that we're not just alone. There's other beings that are around, and it's pretty darn obvious once you start to see that. And so if there is an extraterrestrial component to the negative side, then they are still having to follow rules. They can't do whatever they want. So I understand, I feel your pain, David. I've had to go through this. The same question, which is, how do you get up in the morning? How do you live your life knowing that these people are doing this? And how the hell did they pull it off for so long? How did they get away with it for so long?
Right.
I think one of the things that is worth saying is you are indeed dealing with an extraterrestrial intelligence that is more advanced than we are. And it's therefore able to think farther ahead. It's able to get people to play a role for plans that might not matriculate for several hundred years, and get those people collaborating on an agenda that far outlives their own lifespan. And then we're also dealing with an environment where at the end game, they want to have a lot fewer people on the planet, because if they're going to actually instill a total global dictatorship, if there's too many people, it's not going to work. And so it does appear that they wanted to greatly reduce the population so that they could then enact the very types of things they've telegraphed in so many movies, like the Maze Runner movies, the Hunger Games movies, a movie called The Giver. There's several movies that they've done to basically show us, and it's funny because it's always the young adult or YA genre, right? These movies that are made for tweens and teens.
Mm-hmm.
And they're trying to model this idea of a totalitarian state that basically has military control over the public to such an extreme that the public in many cases is very impoverished, but yet they have this weird high technology as well, just to keep them under control. A holographic display in their little ramshackle cabin while they're working farm labor, that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So these people got away with it because we didn't have the balls. And I hate to say that, but it's really true. We were too afraid. They conditioned us to be afraid. They had control of the media. And in those horror movies from the 80s and 90s, mostly the 80s is when I watched them, the bad guy always has supernatural powers, and the good guys who defeat the bad guy do not. And they only do it by, fighting with whatever conventional means they can and figuring out some clever strategy. So there's been a lot of mind control, a lot of indoctrination to make us think that there is some supernatural power behind this entity. And that includes surveillance. Ultimately, the NSA stuff from Snowden, it was a big reveal, and it's very good that we learned that, but it also helped make people more afraid. Because now people are aware that they're being watched, and they're aware that that's being cataloged, and they're aware that there could be some adversarial force. So again, the thing I've always tried to tell my audience, and I want to tell your audience this as well, because as you said before we started speaking on recording, we have different demographics that we're touching on here.
Mm-hmm.
These folks cannot mess with you. Even guys like you and me, David, we're still here. We're still fighting. Our lives are pretty much unmolested. But for everybody else who's just the mass public, they might have their own little paranoid story. They might be sitting on that egg and nourishing that egg and incubating that fear. It's not necessary. So many people know about this. There are any number. There's hundreds of thousands of videos exposing the cabal that have millions millions of views. It's more popular than mainstream media. It has become mainstream. That's why Trump won the election. If you love him or if you hate him or if you're somewhere in between, you cannot deny that the stuff he was saying that caused all those votes to come in was exposing the truth. It's exposing what we know if you do your homework and you have enough fearlessness that you can actually look at this thing. You know, one of my own family members said to me, I can't live in a world where this is true, therefore I'm not going to look at it. And it's, well, that's exactly why it's worked for so long.